So George has been on me for a little while to try to do a class about philosophy. I can't remember what our first conversation was, but I do think it's relevant. I've kind of gone through phases of interest. Like I used to be really interested in philosophy, and when I got more into certain aspects of like biblical context, I kind of lost interest in Western philosophy for a little while. But about 20 years ago, there was the rise of what became known as the New Atheists. So if you remember anything with like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris, I think it was, there were 4 of them. Christopher Hitchens. And I remember visiting my youngest sister-in-law while she was doing a study abroad in Oxford with ACU. And Jaron and I went over there to do Thanksgiving with her. And we saw a physics professor from ACU that we loved. He was head of the physics department, I think, and also taught philosophy classes. And he said, me and some of the students just went to a Richard Dawkins talk, and the students were bored. It was just positivism, old stuff, and it wasn't interesting. And I don't know if the word positivism means anything to you. We'll probably get to it next week. But it's not what it sounds like. It doesn't have to do with being positive. It's about positing certain types of propositional knowledge. But it's sort of a philosophy that died the death it deserved in the 1950s. And as like real philosophers started looking at what the New Atheists were saying, there just wasn't actually a lot of depth to it. Like Richard Dawkins was really good at being a biologist. He wasn't really good at being a philosopher. And so I feel like in some sense it caught the church off guard because we haven't talked about philosophy a lot. And so when scientists or newspaper reporters or whatever make these big claims about what science means about the nature of the universe, we don't always have good words to like discuss that in the public square. But there are really good answers to that kind of stuff. And so that's one of the reasons that I think it's important. So we're going to do 6 weeks on philosophy, and my son Garrett is going to get us started.
All right. So, as I'm kind of introduced, we're going to be doing philosophy. And so, the quote right here is, "Whoever wishes to become a philosopher must learn not to be frightened by absurdities." And just, we're going to really dive into a wide spectrum of big ideas and just making sure to think everything out and just see everything that there can be. So first, to start off, I'll just kind of give the basics of what we're doing today. So what is philosophy? The first point is that it's a reasoned pursuit of fundamental truths about the world and ourselves. And so I think that's pretty good. That's more of like a literal definition, because whenever I think of philosophy, I think of more of the ideas and trying to like find which ideas you think is true and try to find which ideas impact you and the others around you. And so characterized by a focus on clarity and precise arguments. That's just kind of more the putting the ideas together, trying to see which ideas conflict with other ideas, and trying to find which ideas make the most logical sense to you and which ideas you just can't see would ever really be true. And so I think philosophy is the play and dance of ideas is a really good quote. That's one of my favorites, and I think that really describes what philosophy is to me. But the discovery of what is true and the practice of that which is good are the 2 most important aims of philosophy. So trying to really understand what is true for you and for the life around you, trying to live like the good life and trying to understand like what's happening around you. And so the major branches of philosophy. First is epistemology. And so that branch of philosophy is how can we know something? It's the very start of everything. It's how can I know that I'm really here, and how can I really trust my mind? It's the limits of our knowledge, how much we can trust our knowledge, how much our 5 senses impact our knowledge and the awareness around ourselves. So that's really just the starting place of everything. And so metaphysics is the philosophy of things that aren't tangible. So like what exists, how is it ordered? So like free will, we can't really touch or feel free will, or love, or God would probably be under metaphysics as well. And so these big things that aren't really in the room with us or that we can just see around us, but things we have to think kind of outside the box with. And so metaphysics is a really big category. And so next we have logic, which we won't really be going over as much in this class, but it's just what makes an argument sound, the logical premises that just build on top of each other. That's pretty much all it's about. And so ethics then is part of these two at the bottom, and it's what's good for the individual, what's like the best way to live for yourself, what makes the good life, how should I live, how can I be moral, interacting with the things around me. And then politics takes the I and makes it the we. It's the best thing for the community. It's how to have a moral, virtuous community and how to live together in the best way possible. And finally, aesthetics is the philosophy of the arts and the beauty and how to appreciate that. And so here's our class plan as of right now. Things can always change. But today we'll start with epistemology and we'll continue that on in week 2. And then we'll do 2 weeks on metaphysics. There'll be a break December 1st. And then our plan is to end with 2 weeks of ethics. So for epistemology, here's the foundational question. What is knowledge? So what do you guys think? What is knowledge to you guys?
Anybody want to venture a first definition? Experience.
Mm-hmm. It's important.
Understanding the cause and effect of your environment.
So let's do a thought experiment. Let's say I get here early. I'm trying to set up. I completely lose track of what time it is. And I look at the clock and it's right at 9 o'clock exactly. And I think, okay, it's 9 o'clock. And as it turns out, it really is 9 o'clock. That's a true statement. Did I know that it was 9 o'clock? I see a little shake of a head. Did I have knowledge of the time? If I looked at a clock, it said 9 o'clock, and that is actually a true belief. It really is 9 o'clock. See, I'm nodding of the head. That seems reasonable. Okay, so what philosophers do is we throw a curveball like thought experiments. So then let's say, what if unbeknownst to me the clock is broken? Just out of my good fortune, it happened to be stuck at 9 o'clock. So it's only right twice a day, 9 a.m., 9 p.m., the clock is right. Other than that, it's wrong. I just lucked out and I looked at it when it was at 9 o'clock at a time that was actually true. Does that still count as knowledge, that I knew what time it was?
So it'd be faulty knowledge.
Yeah?
Still knowledge though?
Sure.
So yeah, that's the kind of things you want to think about when it comes to knowledge. And so rather than giving just a definition, kind of things that we thought are really central to knowledge. So it's a belief. Knowledge is something that you have to like see or learn around you and something you really have to believe. But it also has to be true. And so that's pretty important, but that's also pretty confusing because like with the clock thing, it was always true in both circumstances. So that wasn't really the problem. The problem was how you knew it was true. And so does it matter why you believe it? Does it matter that it was a broken clock? Does that like affect your knowledge? Because if it does, that makes a lot of things really complicated. And so knowledge by these 3 things is kind of like the justified true belief. It's something that why we believe it is justified, it's true, and it's something we believe in our heads. And so finally, epistemology, which is the topic of philosophy we'll be talking about today, is the what is knowledge and how does knowledge differ from belief. So we already said that belief is very central to knowledge, but how can it differ from a belief? And then how does knowledge require certainty? How can I ever truly be certain of something? Even is just experiencing it with my 5 senses enough? Like, can my 5 senses be tricked? So how can I ever really be certain that something is true and true enough for me to call it knowledge? And then what can we know? Is there anything that's just outside of our capacity for knowledge? Like, is our capacity for knowledge like pretty much infinite? Can we know everything if we give like all the work? If we spend our whole lives trying to know something, can we actually know it? And I think the most important one is how can we know? Like, how does knowledge work, and how can we be sure that we have true knowledge, or it's just a belief that could change. And so Dad's going to go over a little bit of the history of different philosophers and their beliefs on this.
Actually, before I get into our good friend Pyro, who has the best name in philosophy, I think, I want to think just a little bit more about that. And so well, first of all, how we're going to do class. There's two main ways usually to group philosophy. You can either kind of do it chronologically, so start with Socrates and move forward, or by topic. And like Garrett said, we're going to kind of group it by topic. But today I'm going to walk through several important theories of epistemology, and I'm going to represent them each by kind of one of the main people that was a proponent of them. So we will get a little history of philosophers today too. But yeah, this idea of what is knowledge is really, really important, and philosophers debate it a lot. And so if I could do maybe just one more thought experiment with you now, let's say that I know a guy named Joe, and I see Joe one morning, off there, coming out of a store, and I can tell that he stole something. I see him tuck it under his coat and walk out of the store. Do I have knowledge that Joe stole something from that store? So the most common definition philosophers give is that knowledge is justified true belief. So I cannot right now know that Garrett is 20 years old, because he's not. If I believe that Garrett's 20 years old, that can't be knowledge because it's not true, right? But like we said earlier, if I see that it's 9 o'clock, and that's a true belief, but I was maybe not justified in knowing it because I knew it by looking at a broken clock, then does the justification matter? So here we think, well, okay, yeah, you know Joe, you saw Joe, you recognized him, you saw him tuck something under his coat, leave the store, you probably know that he stole something. Well, then what if Joe's mom comes and says, actually, let me tell you, Joe was in Iowa this morning, his identical twin brother was in that part of town, I promise it wasn't Joe. So were you justified in trusting your senses that it was Joe? But then there's an investigation, and it turns out Joe's mom is a compulsive liar. She was very afraid of her son going to jail. And the truth is, he does not have an identical twin brother. So were you really justified? The problem, and this seems silly, but we've all seen news of court cases that go like this, right? When you interview witnesses. I've read one philosophy book that finally got down to a definition of knowledge because they thought justification wasn't good enough. That if your belief is true based on it being the best explanation of all of the evidence you have and evidence you don't have. So all the things you know and all the things you don't know, put together, the best explanation is that it's 9 o'clock or that Joe stole the thing. The problem with that is, how could we ever know that we have knowledge then, right? Like, maybe you have knowledge if it happens to be true, but do you know that you know? Because you don't have the evidence that you don't have. And so we're going to kind of wrestle with then, well, if there are always some limitations, how do we get comfortable with knowing enough to feel good about what we know? And the first guy we're going to look at is not going to help you feel good about what you know. So Pyrrho was time of Alexander the Great. There's actually a story that he traveled with Alexander the Great to India. So sometimes we talk about like Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, but there were these touch points where maybe they influenced each other a little bit. We don't know much about what Pyrrho believed because he didn't write anything down. So most of what we know about him, the later school of skeptics that called themselves Pyrrhonians, talked about. And so we don't know for sure if it was their belief or his belief, but we know that there was this whole school of skepticism that was called the Pyrrhonians. He is said to have said, you shouldn't rely on what you believe to be true. You might be mistaken. Everything can be questioned, everything doubted. The best option then is to keep an open mind. And what we think he was getting at was a sort of sense of peace. And so that does feel a little Eastern if you're used to the idea of like Zen Buddhism, like kind of let go of expectations. If you don't expect anything, you don't suffer as much. But there are these stories that are probably apocryphal. They're probably not really true. These may have been his opponents making fun of him, but that would say things like he didn't trust his senses at all. And how can you ever be sure of anything, right? And so if I see a cart break loose from the horse that's pulling and it's rolling down a hill to hit me, I don't know that it's really there. I could be hallucinating. I could be dreaming. Why should I move out of the way? And so there are these stories that his friends had to constantly save his lives because he would just walk off a cliff. He would let a dog attack him because you don't know that it's real. Why bother reacting? And so the only way he survived was his friends pulling him back from the cliff. And we don't really know if that's true or not. But it is interesting to think, like, how much can we trust our beliefs? And the two biggest things we're going to see in epistemology, I think, are sensory experience. So I think a couple of our first thoughts about what knowledge is had to do with what we see in our surroundings, how we sense our surroundings, and then sort of pure reason. Can we know things just by rational thought alone, right? And so the first question is, can you trust your senses? Do y'all remember this?
Oh, yeah.
Does anybody in the room see the dress as blue and black? 1, 2, 3 at least, 4. Does anybody see 0 blue and it's obviously a white and gold dress? All right, so we have some of both. The truth is, so the photos can always be weird. The actual dress in real life is blue. Yeah. And here's an image where they tried to make it more extreme. I don't know if you'll still see 2 different colors or not. The one on the right is supposed to be more blue. The one on the left is supposed to be more gold. What I've read is that apparently your brain makes assumptions about whether it's morning or evening or daylight. Is it fluorescent or sun? Is it in a shadow? Is it inside, outside? And you filter out the light tone that you think shouldn't be there. So like if it's morning, everything looks more yellow. So your brain adjusts for that. And so what assumption our brain makes when we see the picture determines whether our brain interprets it as blue or white. But once your brain makes that assumption, it's almost impossible to change it. I cannot make myself see blue in that. So we all think we can trust, like there's probably really a chair here, right? Like my senses are probably okay. But Pyro would say, like, you never know. You were wrong about that. Why couldn't you be wrong about everything? Or then if we think about reason, like, are you ever really certain about things just because they seem to have always been that way? So like, if I pick up this chair and I drop it, did I just see gravity? There were thousands of humans for thousands of years before Isaac Newton that saw apples fall out of a tree and they didn't know what gravity was. Aristotle, actually, if you want to remember the first big 3 Greek philosophers, their first initial spells SPA. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. So the third one was Aristotle. He was like the first scientist in a sense. He was all about like research and the physical world. He had dramatically wrong ideas about how physics works. He thought that just like the natural state of a rock is to be on the ground, so it always tries to return to its natural state. But like planets, their natural state is to hang in the heavens, and so that's just what they do. But the forces are different. It wasn't until Isaac Newton that he said, actually, gravity impacts both of them, right? So you can see a chair fall 1,000 times. You can't ever see gravity, right? Like, what color is gravity? Is it smooth or bumpy? And so how do you know that if you pick that chair up, it's actually going to fall the next time? If I pick it up one more time and let go, could it rise to the ceiling? Probably not. But I want you to imagine being a turkey. And you wake up one morning and the farmer feeds you. He obviously loves you. You wake up the next morning, the farmer feeds you again. You wake up a third morning, the farmer feeds you, he provides you with shelter, he keeps away foxes, he, it obviously has your best intent. It goes on for days and weeks and months. Every morning the sun rises, the farmer feeds you. Then one morning it's Thanksgiving, and the farmer has different intentions. Can we really trust that just because something has happened a lot of times, that it's going to keep happening? All right. Feel free to interject at any time if you want. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep rolling, and we'll see how time goes. Because the next philosopher, I honestly think the history of Western philosophy can largely be understood as reacting to this idea. It's wrestling with radical skepticism. And one of the most famous people to have tried to address it is René Descartes. So one of his quotes is, if you would be a real seeker after truth, it is necessary that at least once in your life you doubt as far as possible all things. So if you really want to have knowledge, at least one time you need to try to doubt everything and see what happens. He was wrestling with Pyrrhonianism, really, this history of radical skepticism. And so his more famous quote is, of course, I think, therefore I am. Which I think gets misinterpreted a lot. People know the quote, they don't always know the context. So sometimes people think, well, he just thought that like rationality was more important than emotion, or he thought we're brains on a stick, or maybe he thought, the image of God from the Garden of Eden is rationality. He may have thought those things, but that's not the point of I think, therefore I am. The point is he was doing these crazy thought experiments of, have you ever had a really vivid dream? he said he had a dream where in his dream he wakes up. And so then now he wakes up and he thinks, how do I know that I really woke up? Or maybe I'm dreaming that I woke up. Like, could this be a really vivid dream right now? Or worse yet, what if instead of a good God, there's an evil demon that is just constantly feeding my brain false information? Everything I think I'm seeing, touching, feeling, experiencing is false belief fed directly into my brain by an evil, powerful demon. So he was too early in history to have computers, but he basically wrote The Matrix. If you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, that was Descartes' evil demon. We just made it robots and computers instead, right? But how do you know? Like, how do you know that your thoughts are legitimate and not being fed to you? And so what he ultimately decided was, I can doubt everything. I can even doubt that I exist. But if I doubt that I exist, doubt is a thought. There's a thought there. So something is thinking. I am whatever that is that's thinking. So if I'm thinking, even if I try to doubt that I exist, I know that I'm thinking. So I think, therefore I exist. And he said that is absolutely indisputable foundational knowledge. And so it gets called classical foundationalism, the idea that we can prove something that we could convince everybody. Like, you cannot doubt that I exist. I can doubt all of y'all exist. You may be part of the Matrix, right? But I exist. And then he tried to build up from there. Now, the problem is almost no other philosopher I know of thinks he did a good job after that. Like, he very quickly jumps to God exists and God wouldn't trick me and so I can trust my senses, and which all may be true. Like, I generally believe those things. But if you don't believe that, Descartes' not going to convince you. Like, the way he proved it is not as certain as the way that he proved that he exists. But his idea was we need to rely on reason alone. And our sensory experience could be tricked, but if I can reason into something like I think, therefore I am, then that can be certain knowledge. Reminds me a little bit of math. I thought about proving some math stuff for you, and I couldn't find the good initial proofs, but if you've ever studied like basic geometry, they start with a couple things that are taken to be just obvious, like the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And then from 2 or 3 assumptions, you can prove all of classical math. Now the problem is you have to have those 2 or 3 assumptions, because every proof says A, B, therefore C. If you don't start with A and B, you can't prove from nothing. And that's kind of what Descartes was trying to start with. But there was somebody that really didn't like what he was trying to do, and that was John Locke. And that was primarily because Locke was overtaken with the glories of science. Science is advancing our culture. Science is the way forward. Science is all about sensory experience. The way that I know how gravity works is I take a heavy bowling ball and a light bowling ball that are the same time, and I drop them off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and I see which one hits the ground first. I look, I hear, I see, I touch, I measure, repeat experiments. It's sensory experience, right? And so he said, the mind is furnished with ideas by experience alone. And what he meant was, we are, when we're born, blank slates. Tabula rasa, I think. Is that Latin? Do you recognize?
Yeah.
I'm probably saying it wrong, but something like tabula rasa, an empty tablet or a blank slate. He thought we come into the world with no knowledge, and so the only way we ever get any knowledge is what we see, hear, taste, smell, touch. It's sensory, all the way down it's sensory experience. And we need to embrace that because that's how science works. And so we need to just trust our sensory experience, and that's how we can build up science. So one thing to think about there is that rationalists like Descartes tend to like what is usually called deductive logic. So deductive logic is if you've ever done a proof in math or something like that, it's that we have a general principle like all cats have hair, and then we have a specific fact, Romeo is a cat, and we build from the general principle to the conclusion that Romeo has hair. And we know how valid arguments work. That's a valid argument, because if the premises are true, if it's true that all cats have hair, if it's true that Romeo's a cat, it is absolutely certain that Romeo has hair. It's a valid argument. Now, it is not a sound argument because one of the premises is not true. Not all cats have hair. There are hairless cats. So in that case, the argument doesn't actually work, but the form is right? That's deductive logic. Inductive logic is, I drop the chair and it falls. I drop the chair and it falls. It appears things fall when I drop them. I keep making observations, right? And so this is sort of the scientific method of I perform an experiment, I record the outcome, then a different scientist on a different continent does the same experiment, they get the same outcome. We keep observing things, and we build up knowledge sort of from the ground up of our observation. So you don't have to start. One example that I thought was interesting is deductive logic is like all gold conducts electricity. This ring is gold, therefore this ring conducts electricity. But what Locke was more concerned is how do we know that all gold conducts electricity? That's what matters. What matters is how we figure out whether gold conducts electricity. The way you do that is scientific experiments, right? You take gold and you do things with it and you see if it conducts electricity, and that's what he thought was important. So he thought inductive reasoning was more important because it would be great to use deductive logic, but we only have things that we can talk about if we've built up experience first. So he was sort of the champion of the scientific method. I'll pause there for a second and see if y'all have any concerns, thoughts. Do you like one of those better than the other? Do you think either one works? Reason alone like Descartes, or sensory experience alone like Locke?
I think all of those examples makes it very obvious how important revelation from God is. Because we don't just deduce, and we don't use all of those forms of logic and reasoning for God. It's that God reveals himself, and he reveals his word through his spirit.
Yeah.
So that's why we can have that assurity. And my understanding of knowledge from the Bible is three things, intuitive, experiential, and full. So, I'm thinking from the biblical aspect, and I think this part is helping me kind of see a broader perspective of it, but that certainty comes from revelation.
Yeah, that's good. And it reminds me of a couple of things I meant to say. First of all, I will admit up front, this is going to be more of a philosophy class than a Bible class, and so we're going to be working with what we can prove with reason and that kind of thing. But I do want to make it relevant. The title of the class ended up being Philosophy for Christians, right? We're here for a reason, and I want to make it relevant to faith and relevant to the Bible, and so we'll look at stuff like that. Today we'll probably have less, unless we get further than I think we will. I think next week we're going to look at some stuff about the process of knowing and look at a particular biblical scholar that talks about how he sees it in the Bible. So we will, we'll do stuff like that, but today maybe a little less than average. Yeah. Okay. Well, good. So let's go back to this and see that, Descartes thought there was a problem with Pyro. Locke thought there was a problem with Descartes. Our next guy is going to point out a problem with Locke. David Hume says philosophy would render us entirely Pyrrhonian were not nature too strong for it. So I'll try to explain that as we go. But if you remember, Pyrrhonian refers to that original skeptic that we looked at. So he's saying that philosophy itself, what we're doing here, would make us all radical skeptics that don't have confidence in anything, except that nature is too strong for that. But one of his big things that he picked at was that Locke's reasoning doesn't really work because you still have to be relying on abstract principles. And it's sort of what I did before with dropping the chair. No matter how many times you see an apple fall out of a tree, you never see gravity. You just don't. And so things like the uniformity of nature, the continuity of the past, abstract principles like gravity, they're all rational things we can think about. They're not simple sense experience. None of those things have a color, a taste, a smell, right? And Locke tries to say it's only sensory experience. And Hume says, I'm sorry, that just doesn't work. Like, you can't make anything of your sensory experience unless you assume rational principles like Descartes did. And his philosophical conclusion is basically Pyrrho was right. Like, we should all just be skeptics. But he ends up embracing what is sometimes called common sense realism, where he says, that's all well and good, but we need to just accept the fact that most of what we see, we really see, and these rational principles kind of make sense, and let's go with it. And actually, that you see that in Francis Bacon too, and sometimes it's called Baconian realism. And that was, coincidentally, maybe, really influential on some really early Church of Christ leaders in America. So people like Alexander Campbell, heavily influenced by Baconian realism. And even how we read the Bible is kind of, in some ways, maybe we'll get to it, influenced by some of how this thought ended up expanding. But he sort of philosophically defeated both positions and then said, but it doesn't matter, I'm just going to use them both anyway. I'm going to use reason, I'm going to use sincere experience. If my common sense says I can trust something, I'm going to kind of go with it. Okay, so let's turn to our first, well, I don't know, this one's a little different. So Simone Weil, she was a French teacher, philosopher, and ultimately Christian mystic. So she felt like she had several kind of direct experiences of the presence of God. What a lot of people would have called like a mystical experience. And to her, that experience of the love of God was the most real, most certain thing in her life. And so her quote here, mysteries inevitably degenerate into beliefs. Degenerate is as negative a word as you assume there. She means it that way. What she means is true knowledge of God is direct experience of God that we can't even put into words. And if we try to talk about it philosophically and we put reason behind it and we prove it and we give evidence and we put it into sentences that have the right grammar, it becomes lesser. It can still be good. We can talk about God, but what we put into words is always somewhat lesser than just an actual direct experience of God's love. Another thing she seemed to say is we can believe in God and not expect God to be rational. So pretty much all of Western philosophy up until this point had been like the worship of reason. Everything is about rationality. We've got to make sure apologetics is proving Christianity rationally. And she said, why should I believe that God is rational? We know there are things in the real world that are irrational. Take the square root of 2. So we may not all be math people, but you know how squares work, right? 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9. The root is going the other direction. So the square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 4 is 2. Well, what's the square root of 2? It's a number that when you multiply by itself, it equals 2. There's certainly no whole number like that. 1 times 1 isn't 2. 2 times 2 isn't 2. Mathematically, there is a number, but it's what mathematicians call an irrational number. So it's literally defined as being irrational. So here's a tiny little snapshot of the first part of the square root of 2. It is an infinitely long number. So irrational numbers, by definition, cannot be written as a fraction. So you can't say it's 2/3 or 3/4. There is literally no fraction that captures it. And if you try to write it as a decimal, it goes on literally forever without ever repeating. There's no pattern, no repetition, what appear to be random numbers forever. Now, I don't know if that strikes you as irrational, but mathematically, the concept of infinity is like literally mind-boggling. I read a whole book on the mathematics of infinity once, and 2 of the early mathematicians that studied it literally ended up in insane asylums at the end. So it's things like, if you take just whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, there's an infinite number of them, right? You can go negative, positive, forever in both directions, so there's an infinite number of whole numbers. But if you take all real numbers, that includes fractions and decimals. So in between 1 and 2, there's a half, there's 2/3, there's 3/4, there's 1.1, 1.01. There's an infinite number of numbers in between 1 and 2. So are there more numbers in between 1 and 2 or more numbers in total? Seems like there's more numbers in total, but they're both infinite. So the other thing, have you ever heard of the infinite monkey hypothesis? That if you have monkeys randomly typing random keys on typewriters, they will eventually write Shakespeare's Macbeth? If you take infinity literally, that's true. Every single sequence of letters would eventually be typed out, and that includes Macbeth. We use Macbeth as an interesting, it captures your attention, but it actually means every single book that has ever been written would eventually be typed by the monkeys hitting random keys. Now that's true in terms of infinity, but there were some recent mathematicians that did calculations that if you use any number that is comprehensible within our universe, so you take the space of our full universe, there's like billions of stars, and you fill the entire universe with monkeys, and you let them type on typewriters for 1,000,000 billion trillion years, there's virtually zero chance they will type anything even close to Macbeth. But if it's infinity, it's true. Because you never get closer to infinity, right? We think if we're counting 1, 2, 3, if we get to 1,000,000 billion trillion, we're closer. You're not closer. That's not closer to infinity than 3 is. because infinity is infinity. Well, that's what the square root of 2 is as well. And there's like real math that depends on stuff like this. Engineers build bridges with irrational numbers. And so Simone Weil said, well, why should we think God is any more understandable than a number? So I thought that was interesting, because we're going to talk a lot about reason and logic and rationality in this class. But here was a Christian philosopher that said, that's all well and good and we should try, but we shouldn't really expect what we put in words to be better than what we can just know of God without words. All right, so where does that leave us? I like this William James quote, there's only one thing a philosopher can be relied upon to do, and that is to contradict other philosophers. I took some philosophy classes at ACU. Randy Harris was my professor for a couple of them. I loved the classes. In the end, I think one of my biggest conclusions, and this will sound like a fancy philosophical word, but hopefully with what we talked about today, you'll get it pretty easily, is that we need at least a little bit more epistemic humility. In other words, what we think we know, we need at least a little more humility about that. And I don't mean things like the existence of God. I feel very comfortable with the existence of God. But I mean when we debate tangential things, right? When we debate secondary doctrines, we can be really confident sometimes. And that's okay, but maybe we can have a little more grace towards each other if we're just slightly more humble about how certain we are in our knowledge. I don't know. What else do y'all think? If we were to pause here, and we have more we can get to if we want today, but if we were to pause here, what does all this confusing talk about knowledge make you think?
How does it affect the man in the pew or the people in the pew?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, part of it is what I just said. I really do hope every person in the pew has a little bit more humility about how certain they are about many things. We'll talk, and we may get to some of this today. I'm trying to leave more time for metaphysics because it's my favorite. And so if I can do some of what I thought epistemology would take 2 weeks in the first week, then maybe we'll open up a little time. But we'll get into some more stuff about how you can know things. And I think we'll probably never prove the level of certainty Descartes was trying to, but getting more confident about what it means to have a justified true belief, like what is warranted belief, and how do we use sensory experience and reason can help us with some process stuff as we think about the process of knowing. So even just how we do Bible study. I mentioned like us being influenced by that Baconian realism. Yeah, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about positivism, which is what I thought we were doing the second week. Positivism is about positing what's typically called propositional knowledge. And what it means is basically just facts. It's a fact that you can state in a simple sentence and that you can probably like kind of measure and quantify and prove. And so they treated all knowledge as factual knowledge, as kind of scientific knowledge, which sort of means that things like love aren't relevant because you generally can't measure love empirically with scientific instruments. Beauty, music, art, maybe even history. Like we can kind of use some scientific stuff to carbon date or whatever, but like you can't actually see Julius Caesar scientifically, so how do we know that he existed? So it's a limited view of knowledge, but this idea that we build up knowledge with separate facts that we state in simple sentences, I think impacted how we in the Church of Christ read the Bible, especially in the early 1800s, and it has had some ongoing influence, where what we would seek to do is pull out individual facts, right? So Paul told the Corinthians to give on the first day of the week, right? Paul said, don't you have homes to eat your meals in when he was talking about communion? We see this and we see that, and we pull out all these facts, right? And then we try to reassemble them. So instead of just reading the narrative, sometimes we're like doing our Bible study by reassembling facts that we pull from different places. And that can be okay. I do think we can prove things by logical inference from facts. But that's not necessarily the only way to know things. Sometimes you lose the plot if you're not reading narratively, right? Sometimes you lose the plot if you don't see the big picture. Sometimes there's other devotional ways of reading. And so I think challenging different ways of knowing can maybe open us up to even like how we do Bible study. Does that help at all with some thoughts? Okay, well, I like St. Augustine's quote here. We are too weak to discover truth by reason alone. So this section, which I thought might be week 2, and we'll probably continue it into next week a little, depending on how we do, but is more about like, how do we come to truth, right? So we were talking about what is truth, how do we define truth? Now, what's a process of coming to truth, and how does human weakness play into it if it does? So positivism had a very favorable account of the scientific method. It basically said there is an identifiable, specifiable scientific method. There is only one such method, and that it is focused on the use of measurement and objectivity to discover truth. So my personal biases are a problem. I need to get out of the way and be objective. I need to measure facts, and there's only one way to do that. There's one scientific method, and if I measure facts that way, and I quantify them, and I'm objective, I can prove a truth. The logical positivists were philosophers 100-ish years ago, maybe 150 years ago. They ended up being called the Vienna Circle because they were in mostly Vienna. And they basically said that science is the only valid knowledge. The only type of knowledge that exists is scientific knowledge. Philosophy has no method other than science. When we're doing philosophy, we're really just using the scientific method. And the task of philosophy is really to take the principles of science and use them as a guide to human conduct and social organization. So this was the idea that science is going to determine politics and ethics and how we structure society, and it's going to lead us in to a bright future because science will help make society better.
What happens when you start to disprove what was once thought to be true?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I mean, Einstein's theory of relativity basically overturned basic Newtonian physics. And then quantum mechanics started to contradict Einstein during his own lifetime. He is famously said to have opposed quantum mechanics because he said God doesn't play dice with the universe, because quantum mechanics implied that some things are not caused, which we'll probably get into when we talk about free will. And so we keep overturning scientific truths, right? I think the bigger challenge to this is just the basic history of the 20th century. Like, from science, we got the atomic bomb. From scientific ideas, we got communism. We got World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. People that thought that rationality was going to lead us into a bright new future of utopia if we could just do it with human reason the right way were pretty disappointed by how history actually turned out in the 1900s. But there's one more step. So there was a group of philosophers that took very formal logic, and formal logic is basically math. So you map out the truth value of a statement with mathematical symbols, and then you prove if other statements can be known to be true. So it's not what you think of as logic, like Brutus is a cat and he has hair. It's like mathematicized logic. And so that was called logical positivism. And they basically just made it a little more extreme. So they were famous for what they called their verifiability criterion, that a statement is only meaningful if a statement is meaningful if and only if it is empirically verifiable. And again, empirically means like evidence from our senses. So scientific evidence that we measured. So what they like to do is a logical analysis of a sentence to see if the sentence was meaningful based on if we knew how to verify it empirically. So one outcome of this is they would say they were neither atheists nor theists because the statement God exists is completely meaningless. We have no idea how we would measure that. So it's just nonsense. It's just words. It's like abracadabra to them. The statement, I love my wife, is probably a meaningless sentence because you cannot verify that empirically. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is beautiful. It's a meaningless sentence. The only way to have meaning is essentially a scientific definition that can be verified through the scientific method. And that's what this sort of like simple protocol sentences means. It's like every sentence has to be a statement of scientific fact. That's the only type of sentence that has any sort of meaning at all. And they really thought that science was going to reform society in a positive way, which, you know, as we talked about, didn't really work out so well.
So happiness.
Yeah.
Happiness wasn't.
You could probably measure certain mental states, you know, like how depressed somebody is or something. But yeah, like concepts of joy were probably pretty meaningless. If it wasn't something psychologists could quantify, it wasn't a real
So emotions,
concept.
then emotions itself.
I mean, I don't know for sure. Like, if there's some way you could measure it, right? If there's some way a psychologist could do a test, then maybe. But your internal experience of love, joy, peace, probably not meaningful, because we can't.
That's kind of how
see it.
I'm seeing this explained as anything tangible, anything
Yeah.
worldly, because anything spiritual, you just dismiss.
Yeah.
Even though it says like, what God said, you have faith of a mustard seed. And that's a measure. He can measure it. We can't measure it.
Yeah.
So it doesn't exist.
The interesting thing to me about this is these original philosophers were very honest about the fact that they didn't believe ethics was a thing. They thought that all statements of ethics were just emoting, just expressing emotion. So if you say murder is wrong, there's no way to measure scientifically wrongness. It's a meaningless statement. When you say murder is wrong, what you're saying is murder, ew. That's what you're saying. You're just expressing an emotion. It's like, rape is wrong is equivalent to just saying rape, ugh. Like that's, they literally thought all you were doing was expressing emotion. It's not a meaningful sentence. And what I find interesting, I mentioned the new atheists at the beginning of the class, is if you listen to what people like Richard Dawkins say, a lot of it sounds very similar to this. The only truth is scientific truth. You cannot prove that God exists with science. But he will still talk about morality. So he'll say religion is bad because it causes immoral things like wars. Right? But then people, and I meant to look up quotes, I can't quote them exactly because I was going to do it next week, but people have pressed him on it. And they've asked Richard Dawkins, like, is rape objectively wrong? And he'll say eventually, if you press him on it, I'm glad to live in a society where we feel it's wrong. Okay, that's not the same as it being objectively wrong. But the new atheists talked about religion being like an immoral influence on society all the time. And I think they were just less consistent about what the logical outcomes of their own philosophy were. If you asked, Bertrand Russell, who was actually our first quote, famous atheist philosopher, so I will quote atheists too in this class, or A.J. Ayers, who wrote the book on this, they were very clear that that they took no stance on the existence of God because it wasn't meaningful. They took no stance on ethics. They didn't they were just honest about that. It was kind of a dark outlook to say like there's no such thing as objective morality, but they believed it. And the new atheists just kind of like gloss over that sometimes, I think. Okay, so let's look at a scientist. Well, I probably won't read this whole poem to you, but I remember this poem from like high school, so it had some sort of impact on me. But on hearing a symphony of Beethoven about the ecstasy of wonderful musical experience. And so like we think Beethoven's symphony itself is art and meaningful and powerful, but the poem itself is also powerful, right? The poetry is powerful about the experience of hearing Beethoven. And the logical positives would say, this whole thing is just blah, 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 blah. You're just at best expressing some emotions. So is that true? Even about science itself. And so this was a scientist, I think he was a chemist originally, that became so interested in how the scientific method works and impacts philosophy that he became a philosopher. And one of his famous statements is, we can know more than we can tell. And I don't know if that sounds profound at first or not, but what he's getting at is that idea of all truth can be stated in simple sentences. And he wasn't a mystic, but a little bit compared to almost like a Simone Weil kind of thing. Like when I say that Garrett knows how to play the piano, there are certain things Garrett could write out as facts about the piano, right? This is how many keys it has. This is what, certain theory, sharp, flat, where middle C is. But if you hear him play, there's a lot he knows that he probably could never put into words, right? And that's what he's saying. But he says this is what scientists do. If you're an actual biologist trying to come up with a new medicine, the way you do real scientific work is you embed yourself in a community of scientists that have shared knowledge. Becoming a scientist is a little like an apprenticeship. you sort of have rituals where you just learn like how to clean a microscope, how to put the sample on the glass, how to sterilize an instrument. There's a certain ritual you do all the time. You usually trust other scientists. Like there's peer review and there's checking, but no scientist has personally reproven everything that has ever been proven in science before. Right? Like if I'm a biologist, I'm not going to prove everything that every major biologist has ever said through my own experiments. I'm going to learn it in school. I'm going to trust it. I'll reprove some things, but I'm just going to do the work in a community of scientists. I don't remember if I have a slide. Yeah, okay. So he says that science is established, grows, and transmitted within the context of a community of skilled practitioners and is built on the trusted testimony of other scholars. So trust has something to do with it, right? Which the logical positives would have had no room for that. And he says that all knowledge is actually rooted in unspoken knowing, which he called tacit knowledge. So if you don't say anything now, I'll take that as tacit agreement, the unspoken agreement, right? What we know is really, it originates in unspoken knowing. And it's personal. Our perspective, what we bring to the equation is not bad. It's a part of the process, right? Like, as a middle-aged white male, I might bring a different perspective to certain things than a young black female or whatever, but that's not in the way of knowing. That's a valid part of how we come to know things. And so we can't be purely objective, but that's okay. And then the way we try to start turning unspoken knowledge into spoken knowledge is articulation. We articulate. And some knowledge can be articulated, but not all. And so if you think about, I work in like kind of an HR-related field, and a lot of my clients have been oil and gas-related, lots of engineers. They will always complain about these like 60-year-old engineers that are retiring and the loss of knowledge. And at first I thought, why are you losing knowledge? Make them write it in a manual. Like, don't you, like, how can you, why are you losing their knowledge? They've worked here for 30 years. Like, write it down. But that's not how it works, right? I mean, there's just stuff that an engineer knows how to do on the job that he cannot write in a manual, no matter how long it is. And that's how Polanyi says science really works. But moreover, he says that's really kind of how all knowledge works. And to try to reduce it to something more mathematical than that is reductionistic. We have to embrace this full process of knowing. And so I got to let you go real soon, but where I want to plant a seed, and then I think we'll talk about this next week, is Drew Johnson is a biblical scholar, and he wrote a book called Biblical Knowing. And he sort of says something similar as what we find in the Bible. He says, in order to know well, you must listen to trusted authorities and do what they say in order to see what they're showing you. So like Polanyi said, science is based on trusting other scientists. Did Adam and Eve listen to the voice of God, or did they listen to the voice of the serpent? Do the children of Israel listen to false prophets or to true prophets? God says, you will know that I am your God, not just because I tell you, but because every year you're going to make a booth and you're going to go live in it. And that process is going to remind you what coming out of Egypt was like. You're going to actually cook a lamb and unleavened bread, and that unleavened bread is going to remind you what it was like to flee Egypt so fast that you couldn't leaven your bread. There's ritual, there's process, there's activity, right? And that's how we know things. And so we're going to look at some specific verses, I think, as we kick off next week. But that's actually kind of the end of what I wanted to do with epistemology. So we will review that next week, but then hopefully we'll actually start to get into some metaphysics, because that's proofs for the existence of God. Do we have free will? Those are like my favorite topics in all of philosophy, and so we need a little more time for metaphysics, I think. All right. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.